Vladimir Putin, the man who has reigned over Russia for nearly a quarter of a century, is now facing the most significant crisis of his career. Once hailed as a strongman leader who restored Russia to global prominence, Putin's grip on power has slipped dramatically in recent years. His once unstoppable rule, marked by military triumphs, economic growth, and the near-total control of Russian society, is now faltering. At the end of 2025, Putin finds himself in a precarious position, with his regime seemingly on the brink of collapse. Putin's authoritarian style of governance, built on control over the political system, repression of opposition, and the consolidation of power within his inner circle, has allowed him to maintain an iron grip on Russia for years. But as the world now watches, the Russian president's hold on the levers of power is no longer secure. The factors contributing to this decline are numerous: a disastrous military campaign in Ukraine, devastating economic sanctions, mounting domestic dissent, and an increasingly fractured political elite. Together, they form a perfect storm that could soon bring about the collapse of his government. When Putin first launched the invasion of Ukraine in February 2024, it was sold as a necessary operation to protect Russian interests, deter NATO expansion, and restore Russia's sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Initially, the Russian public and political elites rallied behind the war, seeing it as an opportunity to assert Russia's dominance and recover territories that were lost with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. However, the conflict quickly turned into a disastrous quagmire for the Russian military. What was supposed to be a swift operation has turned into a protracted, bloody conflict, and the Russian forces have been repeatedly outmaneuvered and outgunned by a much smaller Ukrainian force, heavily supported by Western arms and intelligence. The military failures in Ukraine are the first major blow to Putin's credibility and power. The Russian military, once a formidable force feared by many across the globe, has proven ineffective against the determined Ukrainian resistance. The Battle of Kiev, in particular, was a humiliating defeat for Russia, as its once vaunted troops were pushed back and Ukraine's capital remained firmly in the hands of President Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, fueled by modern NATO weaponry and intelligence support, has pushed Russian forces out of key regions and inflicted heavy losses on the Russian military. By late 2025, Russia has lost thousands of soldiers and vast quantities of military equipment, including tanks, aircraft, and missiles. The war's failure has exposed a critical weakness in Putin's leadership. For years, Putin has sold himself to the Russian people as the protector of the nation, the strong man who could restore Russia to its rightful place in the world. But now, the longer the war drags on, the clearer it becomes that Putin's vision for Russian military power is outdated and flawed. The failure of Russia's military to achieve quick, decisive victories has damaged the Kremlin's credibility and undermined the narrative of Russian invincibility. While the military failures have eroded Putin's authority, the economic collapse in Russia is perhaps even a more significant blow to his regime. Russia's economy, once buoyed by oil and gas exports, has suffered immensely due to Western sanctions. These sanctions, imposed in response to the invasion of Ukraine, have crippled key sectors of the Russian economy, including finance, energy, and technology. Russian businesses are unable to access Western markets, and international financial institutions have cut ties with the country, leaving it increasingly isolated from the global economy. The ruble has been devalued, and inflation has skyrocketed. Basic goods are becoming more expensive, and supply chains are strained. The economic hardships have hit the Russian people hard. Ordinary citizens who once supported Putin's strong leadership are now feeling the effects of his policies. The promises of rising wages, a booming economy,
and a prosperous future have been replaced by economic ruin and uncertainty. The Russian government has responded by imposing austerity measures, rationing resources, and cracking down on dissent. But these measures have only fueled public discontent. What makes the economic collapse particularly damaging to Putin's regime is the loss of support from the Russian elite. For years, Putin has relied on the oligarchs, Russia's wealthy business magnates, who control much of the country's wealth and industry. These oligarchs have benefited from the Kremlin's policies, profiting from state-run enterprises and the exploitation of natural resources. However, as the Russian economy deteriorates, many oligarchs are beginning to feel the squeeze. Their wealth has shrunk as a result of sanctions, and they are now worried about their financial future. Some are even quietly fleeing Russia with their fortunes, seeking refuge in Western countries where they can protect their assets. The growing dissatisfaction among the Russian elite poses a direct challenge to Putin's rule. For years, these powerful figures have supported Putin in exchange for their own wealth and influence. However, as their fortunes dwindle and they begin to see that Putin's leadership may not be sustainable, some are starting to distance themselves from the regime. Putin's inner circle is fracturing, and this loss of support from the oligarchs is a key indicator that his power is waning. The oligarchs who once protected him are no longer certain that his leadership is in their best interest. They may begin to push for a change in leadership, either by forcing Putin to step down or by finding a successor who can restore stability and protect their wealth. In addition to the elite dissatisfaction, ordinary Russians are also starting to voice their frustrations. Protests against the war and the economic crisis are becoming more common, even though the government has done everything in its power to suppress dissent. Independent media outlets are being shut down, and opposition leaders are being jailed or silenced. Despite this, the discontent among the people is growing. Putin's public approval ratings have dropped significantly, and the once loyal population is beginning to question his ability to lead the country. People are tired of living under the shadow of war, economic collapse, and repression. They are starting to demand a change in leadership. The Russian military, once the cornerstone of Putin's power, is also losing faith in its leader. The failure of Russia's forces in Ukraine has created deep divisions within the military leadership. Many high-ranking officers are questioning Putin's decision-making and the strategy that has led to such significant losses. Some generals have even openly criticized the conduct of the war, suggesting that Putin's vision for Russia is outdated and unrealistic. The morale of the Russian troops is at an all-time low, and desertions are becoming more common as soldiers question the worth of continuing a war that seems increasingly unwinnable. The collapse of Putin's control is now becoming evident in every sector of Russian society. The loss of military power, the devastation of the economy, and the growing discontent among the population all point to one inevitable conclusion: Putin's days in power are numbered. The question now is not whether his regime will collapse, but when and how it will happen. Will Putin's internal supporters push for a peaceful transition of power, or will the country descend into chaos as various factions vie for control? The uncertainty surrounding Russia's future is palpable, and the world is watching closely to see what comes next. The geopolitical ramifications of Putin's downfall are immense. A power vacuum in Russia could destabilize the entire region, leading to increased conflict both within Russia and in its neighboring countries. Countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and Ukraine, which have long been wary of Russian aggression, are on high alert, preparing for the possibility of instability spilling over into their territories. NATO will likely be forced to step in to stabilize the region, but the situation remains fluid, and the potential for a wider military conflict remains a concern. At the same time, the European Union and the United States will have to deal with the fallout of Russia's collapse. Russia has already imposed significant sanctions on Russia, and Putin's downfall could lead to a new geopolitical order in the region. The question of how to manage Russia's nuclear arsenal will be one of the most pressing concerns for the international community. A fragmented Russia, struggling with internal turmoil, may become an even greater threat if its nuclear weapons fall into the wrong hands. Putin's regime is teetering on the edge of collapse, and the world is anxiously awaiting the outcome. In the following sections of this video, we will delve deeper into the factors that have led to Putin's loss of control, examine the internal dynamics that are accelerating his downfall, and explore the global consequences of a post-Putin Russia.
Vladimir Putin's iron grip on power has always been rooted in Russia's military strength. The Russian armed forces, once seen as one of the most formidable military powers in the world, have long been the cornerstone of his regime. For years, Putin built a narrative around the idea of a strong, invincible military, an image he projected not just to the Russian people, but also to the global community. The military was the embodiment of Russia's resurgence, and its successes under Putin's leadership were meant to showcase Russia's strength and global relevance. But today, that image is in tatters, and the collapse of Putin's military is a key factor in his regime's unraveling. When Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine in February 2024, he anticipated a swift and decisive victory. He believed that Russia's military superiority would overwhelm Ukraine's forces and that the war would be over in a matter of weeks. The initial phase of the conflict was marked by significant Russian gains, but those early successes were short-lived. The Ukrainian resistance, bolstered by NATO support and the leadership of President Volodymyr Zelensky, proved far more resilient than Putin had expected. As the months wore on, it became increasingly clear that Russia was unable to achieve its military objectives. By late 2025, it was evident that Russia was losing the war, and this loss was felt acutely within the military. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, backed by Western weaponry such as high-tech drones, anti-tank missiles, and advanced air defense systems, decimated Russian forces. The early days of the war had seen Russia make significant territorial gains, but by the end of 2025, Russia had been pushed back in key regions like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Donetsk. The Russian military was not just losing ground, it was losing personnel, equipment, and moral authority. The failure to secure Ukraine and the prolonged nature of the conflict exposed deep flaws in Russia's military doctrine and strategy. Putin's initial assumption that Russia's military would swiftly crush Ukrainian forces proved to be a gross miscalculation. The Russian army, while still powerful in some respects, struggled with logistical issues, poor morale, and inconsistent leadership. Despite Russia's overwhelming firepower, its forces were unable to maintain control over the territory they had captured. The Russian army's command structure was slow to adapt to the changing tactics employed by the Ukrainian forces, and it became clear that Russia's military was ill-prepared for modern warfare. The reality on the ground was far from the image of military invincibility that Putin had cultivated. Russia suffered staggering losses, tens of thousands of soldiers killed or wounded, and thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and aircraft destroyed. What was supposed to be a showcase of Russian military prowess turned into a humiliating defeat. As Russian forces retreated from cities and towns they had once occupied, they left behind a trail of destruction and chaos. The idea of Russia as an unstoppable military force was shattered. In Russia, the military's failure has had profound consequences. Public trust in the government and military has plummeted. For years, Putin maintained a strong relationship with the Russian people by emphasizing the idea of military strength. The military, in turn, was seen as a symbol of national pride and power. However, the failures on the battlefield have made it impossible for Putin to continue to project this image of invincibility. The Russian military, which had once been the ultimate expression of Putin's control, is now seen as a weak and ineffective force. As Russian soldiers return home in body bags and the war drags on, the population is beginning to question
Some have already begun to quietly flee Russia, seeking to relocate their assets to the West. The loss of support from the oligarchs, once a central pillar of Putin's political base, is a significant blow to his regime. Internally, there are already signs of growing political dissent. The opposition movement in Russia, which was once crushed under Putin's iron fist, is gaining momentum. Anti-war protests have become more frequent, and the number of people willing to publicly criticize Putin is on the rise. The youth in Russia, who have grown up under Putin's authoritarian rule, are increasingly disillusioned with his leadership. Many are calling for a new direction for Russia, one that offers peace and economic stability instead of militarism and economic suffering. The economic collapse is also creating a rift between Putin and his supporters. The Russian elite, who once stood firm behind him, are beginning to distance themselves. Many are questioning if it's in their best interest to remain loyal to a leader who has led Russia to economic ruin. As the crisis deepens, it is likely that these elites will increasingly abandon Putin, further undermining his hold on power.
As Russia's military continues to falter and the economy spirals into chaos, Putin's power, once unshakable, is rapidly disintegrating. The foundations of his regime, which were built on fear, repression, and loyalty from Russia's elites, are crumbling under the weight of its internal contradictions. The loss of control over the military, the economic downturn, and the growing dissatisfaction among the general population have led to an increase in internal dissent that Putin is struggling to suppress. For years, Putin's strategy was simple: maintain a tight grip on power through repression of opposition, manipulation of public opinion, and the suppression of any political challenge. He constructed a powerful security state using institutions like the Federal Security Service, FSB, and military police to squash any hint of dissent before it could gather momentum. Opposition leaders, activists, and journalists who dared speak out against Putin were routinely silenced, either through imprisonment, exile, or worse. Yet, in the face of Russia's military failures and economic crisis, the once effective mechanisms of repression are losing their power. Public protests against the war in Ukraine have become increasingly frequent and vocal. While the Kremlin continues to attempt to suppress these demonstrations, the number of people willing to risk imprisonment or worse is growing. Mass protests in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg have shown the true extent of the public anger building against Putin and his government. At first, the protests were relatively small and easily contained by Russia's heavy-handed security apparatus. However, as the situation in Ukraine worsened and the economic situation became dire, the protests grew larger and more frequent. People are no longer willing to accept the status quo. Citizens who had previously remained silent or passive are now demanding an end to the war in Ukraine, an end to Putin's leadership, and a change to Russia's political system. The Russian people are increasingly disillusioned with the promises of strength, prosperity, and national pride that Putin had long marketed. The protests have been fueled by several factors, chief among them being the sheer human cost of the war in Ukraine. Thousands of Russian soldiers have been killed, and the death toll continues to rise with each passing day. Many families, once loyal to Putin and the idea of Russian nationalism, are now mourning their sons, fathers, and brothers who were sent to fight in a war that seems increasingly unjustifiable. The lack of a clear victory and the mounting casualties are forcing ordinary Russians to reconsider their allegiance to the Kremlin. What started as a patriotic effort has turned into an endless war, and the impact of Russian military failures on the home front is undeniable. Moreover, the economic collapse has exacerbated the growing dissatisfaction. As inflation skyrockets and basic goods become more expensive, the average Russian citizen is feeling the bite of Putin's decisions more than ever. The working class, who once supported Putin's narrative of a strong Russia, are now questioning why they should continue to tolerate the hardships imposed upon them by the war and the resulting economic collapse. Unemployment is rising, prices are soaring,
And many Russians are struggling to get by in a country that was once seen as a rising power. The Russian people are no longer content to bear the burdens of the war in silence. Putin's response to the growing unrest has been one of increasing repression. As protests swell and dissent grows, Putin has resorted to increased censorship, media crackdowns, and harsh crackdowns on dissent. Opposition figures like Alexei Navalny, who had long been silenced by imprisonment, have become even more of a symbol of resistance against Putin's rule. Navalny's movement, which had already been a thorn in Putin's side for years, has gained more momentum in recent months. As Russia's people grow angrier and more disillusioned, opposition groups are finding new ways to organize and spread their message, even in the face of repression. Within the Russian elite, cracks are beginning to appear as well. The oligarchs, once the bedrock of Putin's support, are beginning to feel the strain of the country's economic collapse. For years, these elites benefited from close ties to the Kremlin, profiting from state contracts, energy exports, and preferential treatment in exchange for their loyalty to Putin. But now, as Russia's economy falters, these oligarchs are losing their fortunes. The sanctions imposed by the West, combined with the collapse of oil prices and global energy markets, have taken a heavy toll on their fortunes. These oligarchs, many of whom are deeply connected to Putin's power structure, are increasingly nervous about the future. As their wealth shrinks, the oligarchs are beginning to reassess their loyalty to Putin. Some have already begun to leave Russia, quietly shifting their assets abroad to avoid losing everything. Others are distancing themselves from Putin's leadership, hoping to preserve their fortunes by aligning with potential successors within the Russian political system. Putin's inner circle, which had once been united by shared financial interests, is now splintering. This fracturing of support from the Russian elite could be a fatal blow to Putin's regime. Without the backing of the oligarchs, Putin's ability to maintain control over the country's political system and military apparatus becomes increasingly tenuous. The rise of dissent within Russia is not limited to the streets or the elites. The Russian military, which once acted as Putin's most loyal institution, is also beginning to show signs of disillusionment. Generals and officers who had long supported Putin are now publicly questioning the rationale behind the war. As Russian forces continue to retreat in Ukraine, the military's morale has plummeted. Soldiers, once convinced of the righteousness of their mission, are now questioning the value of continuing the war. As the death toll climbs and Russian losses mount, the idea of Russian invincibility is beginning to fade. In short, internal dissent within Russia is reaching a critical mass, and Putin's grip on power is beginning to erode. His once formidable base power is fracturing, and the loyal forces that once supported him are now divided. The protests, the rebellion of the military, and the shift in the support of the oligarchs all point to the same conclusion. Putin's days are numbered. But the question now is not whether Putin will fall, it is what happens next.
The collapse of Putin's regime will undoubtedly lead to a period of significant instability and uncertainty in Russia. Once the strongman leader falls, the country will be left with a power vacuum that could lead to further chaos and possibly even civil conflict. The key questions now are who will succeed Putin, how the transition of power will unfold, and whether Russia can survive the fallout from this political crisis. The future of Russia hangs in the balance. One of the most pressing concerns following the collapse of Putin's regime is the fate of Russia's nuclear arsenal. With a significant portion of Russia's military power resting in its nuclear capabilities, the potential for nuclear instability is a real threat. Russia's military, once loyal to Putin, is now fractured, and the risk of rogue military factions seizing control of Russia's nuclear weapons is a genuine concern. The international community will be watching closely to ensure that Russia's nuclear stockpile remains under control and that it does not fall into the wrong hands. Russia's nuclear weapons are not only a domestic concern but a global one. The United States, European Union, and NATO will be closely monitoring the situation, working to prevent any attempt by military factions or rogue elements to seize control of Russia's nuclear arsenal. There will be intense diplomatic efforts to ensure that the Russian military remains under a unified command, and that any nuclear weapons are kept secure in the event of a political collapse. Beyond the immediate nuclear concern, there is the question of how Russia will transition politically. Russia's future leadership will depend on how the political factions within the Kremlin and military decide to fill the power vacuum. There are several possible outcomes, each with its own set of challenges. The most optimistic scenario is that Russia experiences a peaceful transition of power, with a new leadership emerging that seeks to stabilize the country and end the war in Ukraine. This new government might pursue reforms, including an opening up of the political system, improved relations with the West, and a focus on rebuilding Russia's economy. Such a transition would require significant cooperation among Russia's elites, the military, and the political establishment. However, this scenario seems increasingly unlikely, given the fracturing of Russia's elite and the rising internal dissent. Another possible outcome is that Russia descends into factional violence as different groups within the military and political elite vie for control. A civil war within Russia could break out, with competing factions fighting for dominance. This scenario would be devastating for the Russian people and could lead to widespread instability in the region. The risk of civil conflict would also have significant implications for Russia's neighbors, particularly in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Finally, there is the possibility of a military dictatorship emerging in Russia. In the wake of Putin's collapse, a faction of the military could take control and establish a strongman leader who uses authoritarian measures to restore order and suppress dissent. This new leadership could continue the war in Ukraine or escalate it further, depending on the military's priorities. While this outcome might restore a certain degree of order within Russia, it would not solve the country's deeper issues. Russia would remain politically unstable, and the economic crisis would continue to worsen. Regardless of which path Russia takes, the consequences of Putin's fall will be profound. The international community, particularly NATO and the European Union, will need to carefully navigate the situation to prevent further destabilization in the region. NATO may be forced to deploy additional troops to Russia's borders to ensure that instability does not spill over into neighboring countries. Russia's future is uncertain, but one thing is clear: the era of Putin's dominance is coming to an end.